Ladies and gents, welcome back to another episode of the Carrot Poker School. This is Lecture 9 of Grade 2, and today's topic is going to be flop strategy in 3-bet pots. It's important to understand the variables that affect the way we want to play our range on the flop, because these are actually the same variables that affect the whole game tree. The flop is the first decision point post-flop. It's definitely the most complex one in terms of ranges being very wide and betting for a variety of different purposes, as we saw in Lecture 6. Fortunately, we can often simplify our strategy in a major way, and we're going to do that today. I won't be advocating today simplifications that are extreme like many other coaches would advocate, like actually betting range on textures where that's not a thing, but I think we can simplify in a little bit more of a theoretically sound way while still not being overwhelmed with a complex strategy. Let's get our teeth into today's topic. First off, we're going to start with some inputs. These are what we want to put into our solver. They're the bet sizes that we want to have in our toolkit, and they're going to be a function of the following pre-flop action. We're going to be raising 2.5 BBs, getting raised to 11 in this action sequence, and then calling on the button, or vice versa, maybe we're the small blind here. Post-flop, the bet sizes that we're going to use are going to be a little bit different due to the resultingly different SBR that comes from the pre-flop action sequence. So far, we've been looking at 2-bet pots primarily, but today is all about 3-bet pots, and small blind's flop toolkit was going to be a bit different. I would set your sims up in the following ways and make the following sizes part of your toolkit in 3-bet pots. On the flop, on some boards, we're going to be betting 33% pot. Sometimes we'll do this as an R33, meaning with range. In other situations, we'll be splitting with this sizing. There are actually 4 different broad flop strategies we can play in 3-bet pots that I'll be outlining later. The bet size of 60% pot is going to couple as our big bet for the 3-bet pot flop c-bet. You'll note that this is a little bit smaller than it is in a single raise pot where we use B75. This should come as no surprise, because as we know, at lower SPRs there's less pot building to do with our value region in order to reach that precious investment ceiling that we need to hit by the end of the hand. We'll also have check as an option, but that goes without saying. On the turn, we'll still have 3 different sizes to choose between, although we will be building toolkits with just one of these wherever that's possible, which is most spots in 3-bet pots. B33 is going to be used on more polarizing textures. Something like an ace turn or flush card turn is going to be perfect for this because we're still going to have a lot of value bets, but they're going to be running into a little bit more of a polarized range. Similarly, if the turn comes something like a king or a queen, it's perfectly reasonable to actually range bet your range as a small blind 3-better here for 33% pot. The reason this works is that these favourable turns that we're accustomed to liking from single raise pots are even more lucrative for us in a 3-bet pot. This is because our pre-flop range is more concentrated around the holdings that benefit from these big overcards coming down. B120 is plenty big enough an overbet for a 3-bet pot. We don't have to go larger than this because we're already facilitating pot growth towards the investment ceiling with this sizing, even when the flop goes check check. In fact, the main time where I would advocate overbetting in a 3-bet pot on the turn is actually after you've checked the flop out of position, but done so with a protected range containing some nutted hands like overpairs on a lower board. Your opponent on the button is then checked behind, leading you both to a turn situation where the small blind player retains a nut advantage and will want to make up for lost ground towards that investment ceiling for those big hands. Something like queens on a texture like 6-6 deuce 8 is of course going to want to play for stacks, and a good way to do that is B120 or check raise. B60 is a more catch-all sizing. This is for spots where we've already bet the flop, or maybe we haven't but the turn is more polarizing and we're just looking to increase pot size a bit more smoothly. People go on a lot about geometric sizing as if it's some kind of magical cure-all. If you get the sizing geometric, which isn't even really the right meaning of geometric, but what they mean by that is they're stacking up their bets in an even way such that the same amount of the pot is being bet on every street until they're all in. There's absolutely no reason why this has to be the way that you should play, and solvers indeed reject geometric sizing in lots of spots and are quite happy building funky and unfamiliar pot sizes. As poker is already difficult and we've already taken 19 lectures in this school just to get to this point, you'll know by now that we want to simplify wherever possible. The reason we use B60 is it's a bit smoother, it is a bit more geometric. That's not good objectively, nor is it bad. It's just something that makes the game tree a bit more manageable for us as humans, and a bit more familiar. On the river, we're going to use B33, 75, 150 and 400. 400 is going to be really rare because usually the SPR is such that we just want to be going a bit smaller than this, or we're in a situation where our range is more capped. B33 on the river is really common, especially if we've called a flop bet. We've check called as pre-flop raiser or something like that. B75 is of course just a compromise between a small bet and a big one. The B150 jam will often just be as an overbet, and this is going to oftentimes capture SPRs such as B90, B110, B120, whatever's remaining basically. We can usually just go ahead and jam it when the SPR is 1. We don't need to have massive equity to do that because we're not investing a huge percentage of the pot. And as I say, B400 is a rare guest in our range, but it can exist in certain situations, especially those in which we've gone for a double check raise and that's not actually worked out because villain hasn't been courteous enough to bet. We may go for a check raise with pocket kings on 6-6 deuce. We may then go for another check raise on the turn and end up on the river and mixing between check raise and bomb for 400% pot. This is a line. You might not be familiar with it, you might think it sounds funky, but in GTO terms, it's a line. Just because something looks goofy doesn't mean you shouldn't use it. It means maybe that pool is going to react to it in quite an extreme way and that you should build an exploitative strategy with that sizing. For example, under bluffing in spots where you think that sizing will be looked up too much, and over bluffing in spots where it will be overfolded. If you feel queasy about B400ing the river with a value hand, it probably means you should be bluffing for that sizing. What you shouldn't do is abstain from using a bet size entirely because of an exploitative reason, because if something's good for value, it's probably very bad as a bluff, and vice versa. There is less pot building to do even in cases where we have a more polarized range and a large nut advantage. So both B75 and B150 have been removed from the turn toolkit and reduced to sizes which aim to keep the SPR smoother and more familiar. This is not for any objective gain. Let's have a fun exercise to start off today's lecture. What we're going to do here is match these jumbled strategies and EVs to the flops on which they apply. The correct strategy for Ace Jack 6 two-tone is not the one listed there, nor is that the correct EV for the out of position player. What I'd like you to do now is look through these 7 situations, look at these textures, they're all small blind versus button, 3-bet pot, scan down them and try to decide which strategy and which EV goes with each flop. Again, I'll stress this, these have been jumbled up. The EVs and strategies you see here, adjacent to the flops, need not match up to that flop nor with each other. So for example, with this top flop, that is not the right EV nor the right strategy, but that strategy also doesn't go with that EV. It's all very confusing, and I'd like you guys to sort it out for me. Assuming that you've done that and you've given it a bash, you can now unpause the video and let's go over the answers. You may have had some impressions about these flops that were quite strong, and that might have led you to be able to pick out maybe the most extreme strategies first. But what we're going to do is go down in order from top to bottom here. So Ace Jack 6. This is a very reasonable board for your range as the small blind 3-better. You're going to have a big range advantage on this texture. Ideally, the Jack, the King and the 10 should be viewed in this configuration as the better broadways for your range. The reason for this is that the main broadways that villain flats against your bets don't tend to contain as many of these cards compared to what your 3-bet range contains. And this should be seen as a concentration of ranges, not in terms of absolute combos. The Ace is a decent card for the small blind, it's not the best broadway nor is it the worst, and the 6 is low enough that it's not really a danger card. The main danger zone that you want to be aware of as a small blind 3-better is when multiple cards between a 6 and a Jack appear. Of course, the 9, the 8 and the 7 tend to be the worst ones because these are the pairs that are flatted at the highest frequency without being 4-bet. On Ace Jack 6, we're going to be really happy with life. Our EV advantage is going to be large, and that's going to push us to using a large betting frequency. You'll recall from grade 1 that betting frequency is the thing that's driven by how well your range is doing overall against that of your opponent. Range advantage allows you to bet more frequently. Therefore, on Ace Jack 6, we're going to be betting quite a lot. We're not always betting this texture, but we have a high bet frequency, but we're going to use a small sizing. Sizing, meanwhile, is driven by nut advantage or polarization advantage. What Ace Jack 6 does is connect in a major way with small parts of our opponent's range and really hurt the EV of large parts of it. When villain has a lower card hand like 10-9, 9-8, or 7-6, with the exception of the latter, that's actually okay, let's say 8-7, these hands are going to be hurt a lot, as are all of the numerous combinations of 9s, 8s, 7s, 5s, 4s and 3s. Some people will even have the audacity to flat deuces against us in this spot. Meanwhile, if villain has a hand like Ace Queen, Ace Jack, Ace 10, anything like that, the hand is going to be doing very well. Villain does not have very many combinations of medium equity hands here. These are restricted to just a few combos of King Jack, Queen Jack, and Jack 10 suited, maybe Jack 9 as well. So for the most part, villain's range is either very strong or very weak. Our range is much more merged meanwhile because we have more combos of Kings, Queens, 10s, that sort of thing, combos that villain would have 4-bet pre, and so we're the one with the less polarized range. When you have a less polarized, i.e. more condensed range than your opponent to start off with on the flop, you want to go ahead and use a small sizing. Our EV here is 59%, it's not the highest it could be, but it's still very good. I don't mind simplifying to betting all of your range for a small sizing here. The things I would avoid would be using a big bet or range checking or something like that. Let's move on to 8-7 deuce. 8-7 deuce is a board that's not horrendous for us, but nor is it very good. There are two danger zone cards here, the 8 and the 7. Two cards alone isn't enough to dramatically reduce our EV, but it is enough to neutralize it and render this a neutral world. The 8 and the 7 don't add a lot of pairs to villain's range, but what they are is non-broadways. Non-broadways are going to preserve the equity of hands like 9s, 10s, 6s, 5s and 4s to some extent. Meanwhile, the broadways that villain shares with us, like Jack 10 and 10-9 suited, are going to be doing fairly well on this texture. The broadways that are unique to us, like Ace King offsuit and Ace Jack and King Queen offsuit, okay, King Queen isn't unique, but it's more in our range than theirs, these hands are going to be suffering a lot on this texture. One of the reasons that your range really struggles here is that you have hands like King Jack offsuit and villain doesn't. Remember, we saw in lecture 1 of this grade that ranged advantage is not just about having nutted hands, it's also about whether you have a higher concentration of knives or spoons. In other words, power 2 or power 1 hands respectively. When you have a lot of feeble hands in your range, it's really going to bring down the overall EV of that situation for you and force you to use more checks. Overall then, we're in an okay world where our range can bet semi-frequently, but not as frequently as on the flop above. Meanwhile, villain's range is much less polarized now. Villain has combinations here like 9s, maybe some 10s depending on their 4-bet strategy, Ace 8, 6s, Ace 7, possibly something like 9-8 suited. They just have a lot more mediocre hands, Jack 10, 10-9, same thing, hands that are mediocre in equity. When villain has a lot of hands like these, and we meanwhile have some very bad hands like King Jack off, Queen Jack suited, and then some very great hands like Kings and Aces that our opponent of course cannot have, that's the hallmark of this spot, they can't have the overpairs and we can, we're going to want to use a large sizing. So on this flop, we choose to bet semi-often with a big bet when we bet. We'll talk later about how to build this checking range and make sure that we don't just do it in a bottom-heavy, weak kind of way where we're actually being exploited by someone that stabs a lot. Our EV here is 49% pot. This is a fairly neutral world. You might find your sim returning a slightly higher EV than this for the small blind player if you're using a higher stakes rake structure. For example, these sims are built at 100 NL rake structure on PokerStars because that's the game that a lot of people play who are studying this grade. If you play lower, you may find that your EV here is even worse because the button should theoretically be flatting a bit tighter and should therefore just have more pocket pair density and less sort of suited connectors and suited aces that brick here. Meanwhile, if you're playing at higher stakes that have lower rake, the in position player is allowed to flat much wider in terms of suited medium strength cards, which tend to just lower the EV in general on low boards. As this flop contains an 8 or a 7, this rake effect won't be super strong here, but you will find that it's a little bit influenced by the original ranges. 49 though is a reasonable ballpark figure for this spot, and we should just really consider that that's not important exactly. It's not a race to see who can get above 50% EV. What's really important here is this is just simply a neutral world. The queen high flop, queen 6-5 is much less beneficial for the small blind than you might think. Note that there are 2 to 3 danger zone cards here. The queen is a borderline danger zone card because our opponent just makes a lot of pairs on that card. When you look at their offsuit flats pre-flop, the more abundant ones combinatorically speaking, because offsuit is more combos naturally, you're going to see quite a lot of ace-queen and king-queen. Both players have a lot of suited queens, but villain probably has a higher density of offsuit ones. More on that later. The 6 is very much a danger zone card, and the 5 is creeping in there too, meaning that villain has a good amount of set and top pair potential on this board. The fact that the flop is monotone is not great for us either, because that's going to ruin some of the EV of our overpairs on different runouts. Therefore, we want to bet very infrequently on this texture. The solver is torn when it comes to the question of how big our nut advantage actually is here and what the relative polarization of this spot is like. What Pile Solver is effectively saying here is that our nut advantage is still reasonable because aces and kings are performing okay, but because jacks and tens or other unique overpairs have been negated, and due to the presence of 2 set making cards for villain, the 6 and the 5, this is going to just be a slight nut advantage. You can big bet here, you can small bet here, and you can check, but I think the simplest way to simplify your strategy on a situation like this, that's actually quite low EV for your range comes in at only 41% pot share here, is just to check everything out of position. You might feel a little bit intimidated by applying such a strategy, it may feel alien, but this is not too different to how you would play as a pre-flop caller. Imagine the situation was reversed pre-flop and it was actually the out of position player that was calling the 3-bet. In a spot like cutoff versus button on a board that was good for the button 3-better's range, you would never dream of leading. Therefore, what's so weird about checking here with 41 pot share and EV with all of your range? It doesn't really matter who the pre-flop 3-better was, the solver doesn't actually care about that at all and only uses it as a reference point to determine the starting range. In other words, initiative is not a thing. Range advantage and nut advantage basically single-handedly determine flop strategy, and we shouldn't worry about who the last player was to physically put the chips in the pot. 9-8-7 is the most abhorrent flop for your range out of all of these 7 textures. This one, the solver basically says, your range advantage has been all but fully decimated, your EV is now in the 30s, this is very bad, this is critically low, and therefore we start with effectively a range check strategy. You'll note that if the solver is betting here, it has a preference for the smaller bet because the 3 danger zone cards, again to reiterate, those are cards that absolutely smash the in-position player's range. 3 of these creates not just sets and 2-pair, but also straight draws for pairs like 10s, 6s and 5s, as well as just straights for Jack 10 and 6-5 suited. The reason this is bad is that although both players do have a lot of these combos, the small blinds combos are more diluted by awful hands like King Queen off, Ace Queen off and Ace King. Having too many of these hands in your range, as well as stuff like Ace-4 suited, is going to be horrendous for you here as the 3-better, and you want to treat this as your opponent's flop. That's right, when you 3-bet pre and the flop comes 9-8-7, you can forget who the last one was to invest, it's all about range versus range. 4-4 deuce is a better flop than 8-7 deuce. The reason for this is that there are no danger zone cards. This is a low board and it will not be massively high for your range and EV, but it will be the positive side of neutral, coming in at 60%. You can do a lot more betting on this texture than you can on the 8-7 deuce, but your equity is still not that high. In fact, most of your EV is derived from nut advantage and the absolute prevalence of your overpairs, which are still basically mighty in strength and borderline invincible. When you have lots of combos that are extremely powerful and entitled to more than the pot in EV, and your opponent does not, your nut advantage will make up for the fact that you have too many combos of King 10 and King Jack off, etc. 4-4 deuce is an incredibly polarized configuration for the pre-flop 3-better. They're going to have hands that are just massive due to being massive pre-flop and not getting in any way negated. In fact, the presence of the 2-4s strengthens a hand like Pocket Kings because it makes it harder for villain to actually outdraw by making 2-pair. On something like 4-3 deuce, Pocket Kings could be outdrawn by Queen Jack more easily than on 4-4 deuce by 2-pair. So on this flop, we recommend playing a relatively high bet frequency or a big sizing. I don't think this is the spot where you want to bet everything because you have a few too many terrible hands in your range for that. You do also need to remember to play a mixed polarized strategy, which means that your good hands here are not always betting. They're mixing check into their strategy as well, and that's a good way to go on 4-4 deuce. Jack deuce deuce is one of the best flops imaginable with a small blind. Not only do you have one of the so-called friendly broadways, we'll talk about that later, but you also have the presence of the innocuous pair. What the innocuous pair of deuces will do is it will basically never harm the strength of your overpairs. In fact, it will bolster them while making it harder for villain to outdraw you by going runner 2-pair. In this situation, villain's backdoor flush making ability is also harmed by the fact that the board can bolt up much more easily when it already contains a pair. The top of your range is absolutely thriving on this texture, and a lot of your formerly air-like hands on lower boards have hit the jack. Ace Jack, Queen Jack, Jack 10, Jack 9 and King Jack are some of the most common broadways in your starting range, and the fact that they hit this card is great. Meanwhile, villain will be 4-betting hands like King Jack off, folding hands like Queen Jack off, and will just not have as many combos that hit top pair here as a percentage of their range as we do. And therefore, we want to go ahead and play an almighty, aggressive strategy of betting big and always. That's right, you can range bet big. Your frequency does not dictate your sizing. These are separate variables. On King 7 deuce, we have a fairly good nut advantage, but villain's range is somewhat polarized by the presence of the king. In other words, the pairs in villain's range, like on the Ace Jack 6, have become worse, though they haven't become as bad since there's only one Broadway here. The problem with 2 Broadways for the pocket pairs is not only are there 2 ways that we can have outdrawn them, but also our remaining unpaired cards have straight draws. On King 7 deuce, we don't have straight draws with a hand like Ace 10, at least not front door ones, and villain's 8s and 9s are kind of surviving. Their semi-merged hands are quite bad, but not as bad as they would be on Ace Jack 6. I'd like to think about King 7 deuce as a semi-polarizing texture for our opponent, and it's one on which the solver is torn between sizes. You want to bet fairly often on this texture, in fact you probably always want to bet, and it doesn't really matter which size you use. When there's a king or a queen on the flop, the solver will normally not be able to make up its mind between a big bet and a small one, but it will prefer a small bet on an ace-high board or monotone board. On king 7 deuce then, we have this strategy of betting always, and I would simplify to just one sizing. I tend to use a small bet here because I actually think the big bet might be a bit easier for pool to play against on a texture like this. I should note that 71% EV for the jack deuce deuce is absolutely phenomenal. Our EV isn't quite as high on king 7 deuce, but it's definitely the second best board for range, coming in at 67% pot share. I hope you got most of those right. If you didn't, don't despair. It's a very good opportunity to pause the video, study this, and profit a lot by learning these patterns. Some people run aggregated reports, meaning that they get their solver to generate bet frequencies and strategies for 100 flops at a time or something like that. While that's an option if you know what you're doing, it's really important to be walked through the variables that affect sizing and frequency before you get your teeth into an aggregate report. I don't mind you guys running reports for hundreds of flops as long as you can follow what I'm talking about in this slide. When we face a polarized range, we need to understand that that might not be because villain has done anything that polarizes their range. It may be because the texture has come down in such a way that's left their range more naturally polarized. On ace-jack 6, for example, our EV is very high. We're definitely the leader here in terms of both EV and equity, but nevertheless, if we look at villain's range, it looks quite polarized. This is the carrot poker school, and as a goofy kind of theorem, the more carrot-like a range looks in this EV display in Pio Solver, the more polarized it is. This is because the very strong hands like ace-queen, ace-jack, and pocket sixes are green, and the weak hands are orange. When you see yellow in there and the range becomes less carrot-like, if you'll entertain the semi-joke here, what's happening is that the range is merging out towards medium-strength equity. As the jack, as I say, is not a very common combination in the pre-flop range of the in-position player, you're not going to see a lot of yellow hands here, meaning that the range remains quite polar. This is the very thing driving our impetus to bet small instead of large. Here we see the overall bet frequency, which is 67%. We've looked at this already, and now we can understand that not betting range here isn't really a function of us not doing well. It might just be because villain is quite polarized. B0 is a small size, and you want to use more small sizes against a very polarized strategy. In this spot then, villain's range contains hardly any yellow hands. Clark's theorem recommends a small bet. We know this by now, I won't go over it again. And note that big bet would have a very detrimental and stark splitting effect of our opponent's range on the button. Button would be able to call all and only green hands and simply fold the orange ones. While it's true that we would put some combos like king jack and queen jack into an indifferent situation, we'd usually just be overspending to reduce the EV of something like 9s to 0. Put it this way, if you check 9s has a little bit of EV, you don't want to do that when you have this much fold equity necessarily with a lot of your range, but you also don't want to overpay to reduce that hand's EV. When villain has a hand like ace 10, there's no meaningful sizing that will reduce the hand's EV to 0 apart from maybe an overbet, but we don't want to be overbetting this spot against a more polar range. Bearing in mind that villain does have ace queen, ace jack and pocket sixes a significant amount of the time because his range is smaller to begin with in a 3-bet pot. 9s is a hand that if we go too big, basically would not be indifferent anymore. 9s is only indifferent, as we see here, between raising, calling and folding if we're to use a small bet. If villain raises this hand, it's very much a hybrid. The hand can make us fold better hands, sometimes like 10s, can fold us off of some equity in the form of something like king 9 suited, and it can also get us to call with some kind of draw, which this hand is doing okay against. Fourthly and finally, 9s is a draw to a set after all, and when you raise and get called and bink a 9, you're in a very good world. When you have the 9 of spades, this effect is much stronger because you can't actually turn or river the set that makes the flush possible. This is why raising with a spade is so important, and you shouldn't raise without one. Nut potential only exists when you have the 9 of spades blocker. Let's talk now about the opposite of this when we're actually facing a merged range. We saw that on lower boards, villain's range is going to be less polarized. 8-7 deuce is the perfect example of such a texture where villain's range is more merged. You can see that the range is less green and less orange and now more yellow. What this means is that we'll be running into a mediocre hand more often, and a mediocre hand will require a larger sizing made against it in order to become indifferent. Again, our goal is to reduce the EV of as many hands in villain's range to 0 as possible, and if you're wondering why 0, the reason is that we can't make them negative. The reason that we can't make somebody's range negative in any way in game theory is that they would just fold all hands that weren't profitable continues. The main goal, however, is to avoid overpaying for such an effect. Here we see the solver using the largest bet available, which is the b60, and this is definitely amply big to make villain indifferent. We're also going to be approaching our investment ceiling with a smooth geometric sizing plan with this flop bet, and that's an argument for simplicity, not EV. Villain's range is completely merged here. Because most of the hands are yellow, we can see this. Why the EV view is so nice at a glance, you can just get a very quick bird's eye view of how polarized or depolarized your opponent's range or your range is. Then you can compare them. Clark's theorem is the theorem that compares range polarity between yourself and your opponent, and it basically says to use bigger investments on such a spot. Small blind's range, you can see, is much more green and orange, definitely more polarized, and that's why we use large sizes. There are two ways to use a large size against the merged range. You can b60 or larger, or you can go ahead and check raise. Check raising is a much bigger size and a much better size if villain bets, so if you knew villain was going to bet, you'd always want to check raise. The downside is that it allows villain to check back and realize equity. That's not an argument not to go for a check raise. A check raise is completely viable here. It just gains some EV from the fact that it gets more money in the pot and loses some in the fact that it gives free cards. You also receive a gain of EV when you check raise when you get villain to bet a hand that would have folded to your large bet, and you lose EV whenever villain has a hand that checks back but would have called your large bet. It's a trade-off. Low dry theorem is the theorem in the Carrot Poker School that actually talks about a plan. A plan in poker is a choice of actions over one or more nodes. Usually in poker, you shouldn't plan. That's to say, when the flop comes down 9-7-5, you shouldn't make a plan about what you're going to do on the river because you don't know the action sequence or the run out yet. You used to hear the old adage back in the day that went as follows: you've got to plan the hand. You don't have to plan the hand, you have to think strategically through the node you're on, but in some cases it can help to predict what to do on the next node as well. Because, for example, when you check the flop, being able to check raise is the only reason that allows you to check an overpair, you need to know that that hand is then a mandatory overpair after villain bets. If you don't know why you're checking the flop and you don't know why it's okay, you might need to think about the next node or next couple of nodes in some situations. However, we shouldn't get too carried away with planning and shouldn't feel like we have to have every base covered. Part of the fun and part of the journey as a poker player is to figure a hand out as you go and notice the changes in the ebb and flow of a hand as action sequences and different textural occurrences affect the EV and polarization of situations, affect the toolkit you want to use, and many more factors. So don't get carried away with this, but this is what we mean by planning. Low dry theorem says that when the flop is low and dry in a 3-bet pot, we can usually simplify to just 3 plans. Check raise is a plan because we're predicting not just the node where we check, but what to do if villain bets. We can also be 60 or we can check fold. That's right, there are very few hands we actually need to check call in a low dry board, and I would recommend that when you first get started with 3-bet pots, that you even consider ditching your check call range entirely. When we look at some sims where we see check raise plans, we'll note that we don't actually have any hands in our range that can only proceed by check calling. This partly comes down to how useful fold equity is on the flop and how there's such a mixed array of reasons for investing money as a check raise or a bet, and that would be a big bet. We're going to take a look at 2 different nodes here, decision points, in the 3-bet pot. Firstly, small blind's original flop strategy, which will be b60 or check, and secondly, small blind strategy after checking and facing the theoretically recommended sizing for in position of 33% pot. Note that we don't need to check a lot of our overpairs in an attempt to limit losses. That's not what we're doing. At low SPRs, we're actually trying to rush pot growth by checking, paradoxically, because checking facilitates check raising, and that's a much more acute way of accelerating pot growth. So in 8-7 deuce, this is our small blind c-bet strategy. You can see that it's a mixed polar strategy, meaning that just like in a single raise pot, blind versus blind, or out of position against a cold caller, we protect our checking range and look to check raise some hands that could also value bet. Meanwhile, we can also check raise our bluffs, and you'll see that a hand like Jack 10 isn't always betting. I think if you surveyed 10 50NL poker players, then on average about 8 of them would just always bet Jack 10. What you'll find your opponents do here exploitatively, and I love to give you a little bit of a sneak peek about our exploitative course as we go, stay tuned for that at carrotcorner.com, we're going to see people actually overstab with pairs and draws on this node. What this means is that our opponent actually bets a more merged range than they should and are betting their medium strength hands too often. This incentivizes check raising. Check raising is a very good way to play against a recreational player that will happily just bet 9s every time when checked to. That hand shouldn't always bet, but it will when it belongs to certain player types. With 8-7 deuce, I recommend that you stop in your tracks before you routinely bet with a hand like aces, kings, queens, jacks, nines, and also stop with a hand like queen 10, king 10, jack 10 backdoor, because you're going to be able to raise those just as easily as you're going to be able to bet them. Checking and allowing villain to bet first doesn't ruin the viability of value betting, nor does it ruin the viability of bluffing. It just maybe means you have to be slightly more selective, but not to a large extent. Remember that when you have a hand here like king jack, you also just have pair draw, plus some backdoors. When you check and you face the B33 from the button player, this is what you're going to do. You do have to be a bit fussier now with what hand you're raising. You're looking for more immediate backdoor draws. You can see that ace jack and king jack no longer raise, but ace 10 and king 10 do. That's just due to the immediacy and frequency of making it straight. But you'll also see that plenty of overcards do go for check raises here. Things with big brutish overcards like ace king, ace queen are more than happy to play this way. The only hand in your range that actually has to call and not raise here is ace jack, but you can also fold that against a bet. It really does seem permissible to get rid of check call entirely in this strategy and simplify to just folding or raising when villain bets. Of course, if your opponent knows you're playing that way, they should change their strategy and definitely check back a lot more on the flop, but that's okay, they don't know what we're doing. Again, we can often make simplifications in poker that make our lives easier and don't actually give anything away. Beware the Dreaded Queen is actually quite a funny title. It's become somewhat of a thing in our Discord group to say this. The way to understand Beware the Dreaded Queen is basically the queen sucks when you're a 3-better unless you're in a certain early position configuration. The reason the queen sucks for you in late position when you're the 3-better is that your opponent's most abundant Broadway by far is going to be this monarch. The female monarch arises in ranges very frequently because combos like ace queen suited, king queen suited, queen jack, queen 10 suited, as well as ace queen and king queen off appear in the button's flatting range here, as well as the small blinds and to some extent the cutoffs against 3-bets pre-flop. Meanwhile, the king is 4-bet at higher frequency, and the jack and the 10 are folded quite often, so those just don't feature as often as the queen. This strategy is quite pessimistic, but it's not unjustifiably so. Don't want to be making many investments when you're an EV dog, and your EV here, as we see at the top, is only 41% on such a texture. The fact is that button just has a far greater concentration of Queen X than any other Broadway, mainly due to offsuit combos, the ones with the gold stars being so abundant. The reason that I've starred suited combos silver is that they're slightly less relevant than offsuit combos. Hand grid charts are misleading. They don't represent the amount of combinations that these hands actually make up. Pocket 9s here looks like a lot of combos because the box is full, but it's only 6, whereas ace queen offsuit is nearly 12. Now I only say nearly because at some frequency this solver is doing something else, it's 4-betting that hand. I wouldn't really 4-bet this hand though in these configurations. King Queen even exists offsuit, and while both players do have quite a lot of suited queens, it's going to be the in-position player that has them at the higher frequency. That's because there aren't combos like Ace King or King Jack off diluting those hands. It's all about concentration, not absolute number. Beware the absolutism of actually saying that small blind has more Queen X. This is true, but button has more Queen X for the purposes of EV. In other words, Queen X contributes to the EV of button's range more heavily than it does small blind's range because Queen X is a larger region of the former than the latter. That's key. The friendly Broadways, the ones that you should be happy to see that will cause you to bet all of your range with a smile on your face and move on to the next node, would be the King, the Jack, and the 10. Again, the King is great because villain will 4-bet it a lot and often fold it. The Jack is great because villain will just fold it a lot and sometimes 4-bet it, and the 10 will usually just be folded pre. Of course, ace 10 off can 4-bet in this configuration though. So next time you see a queen on the flop and you're in a 3-bet pot, don't tar it with the same brush as the other Broadways. This is a wolf in sheep's clothing. It's not a nice card for a range in many of these spots. You may remember the tagline, beware the dreaded queen. If you don't, just try to picture a villain with a lot of ace queen, king queen sort of combos. The absolute quantity fallacy is one of the most destructive fallacies in the entire Carrot Poker skill. To illustrate how this fallacy works, I'm going to show you a couple of Tupperware tubs containing some blue and yellow balls. Question 1 is this, and this is the wrong question. Which of these buckets contains more blue balls? Although this is the wrong question, I'd like you to go ahead and answer it. That's right, it's definitely bucket A. While bucket A contains 8 blue balls, B has only half of that, containing 4. This isn't very useful though, because if we were playing a game called Can You Pick a Blue Ball Out of Your Bucket, you'd want to choose bucket B as the bucket of choice. Choosing bucket A because it contains more blue balls would be to completely forget about the fact that it's the frequency from which you draw the blue ball from your bucket that actually matters, and not how many started there in absolute terms. Thus, the correct question to ask yourself about this game would be the following. If you dip your hand into a bucket blindfolded and pick out a ball, from which bucket would you pick the blue ball most often? This is the question that matters in this game, and I know you won't be playing this game for money, but in poker, the very same thing applies. You want to be picking out the right combinations from your range more often. In other words, when I open and you 3-bet me, I want to be looking down at aces and not at king 10 off. Unfortunately for me, there are twice as many combos of king 10 off in my bucket as there are of aces. When the flop comes down queen high, the fact is that bucket A, let's say the small blind's range, just contains way more combos, way more balls overall, but not as many of them are as a queen as in bucket B. Bucket B has less balls because the pre-flop caller tends to 4-bet or fold a lot of combos and just doesn't get there to the flop with as many, but nevertheless, bucket B contains more likelihood of picking out a queen. So assuming that the flop is something that's pretty dire for a range, like 3 danger zone connected cards, 7-5-4, 9-8-6, 9-6-5, possibly even something like 10-9-8 to a lesser extent, how would we want to go about crafting our strategy? The simple answer is that the solver is going to be betting at a low frequency, but it's much easier for us to be betting at no frequency. Checking everything is a very familiar simplification because we do it all the time in the big blind in a single raise pot. You might think I don't play range check strategies, but actually you do every time you flat the buttons open. For example, when the flop comes something like Jack 8-7 and you routinely check to the button, you've just violated the solver's advice to build a 15% donk range. You don't have to build that 15% donk range, and there's no EV loss in theory by foregoing it, but I want you to understand that you're deviating. You're deviating when you check range on queen 6-5 two-tone in a 3-bet pot, small blind versus button, but the deviation is so small and minor, it changes so little about the spot that it's completely fine and it's easier for you to play. You don't really gain anything by building a 15% betting range, but you gain a lot of peace of mind and understanding of what you're doing, as well as cutting down your learning, your homework, if you simplify the game tree to range checking instead of betting these absurdly small frequencies of the time. Let's have a look at how to do this. On 9-8-7, we saw that small blind's EV was a miserable 37% of the pot. What this means is that we're going to check everything, and having done so, we're going to play a lot of raising. Hold on, I thought we were checking because the spot's terrible, why are we raising a lot? Well, we're not actually raising a lot, we're just raising as a fairly primary means of continuing. Whether we raise or not is not actually to do with our overall EV, but it's to do with the EV of certain parts of our range, mainly the nutted region. Because our overpairs like jacks, tens and queens are still fairly good here, so are kings and aces, but they're a little bit more stable and in less in need of fold equity. I'd actually much rather have jacks here than have aces as well, because I'd like to have the straight draw. It's just way more important to have that. Be able to cooler villain when it comes a 10 and villain has pocket sixes or a 2-pair or a set. That's a really nice thing to be able to do. I generally don't like the word cooler because it can relieve your responsibility unnecessarily, but you know what I mean in this case, I hope. Back to the main point, we're not checking here because we're terrified, we're checking here because we have a lot of miserable hands that need to check fold. We're not checking kings because we hate kings, we're checking kings because it just faces a bet often and it's a fine way of investing with the hand. Remember, we've said this time and time again in the school, whenever you can check raise, there's usually no need to bet, unless you have a massive advantage and villain would just be checking back all the time. In this situation, we can clearly get rid of this ridiculous 3.14% bet. There's no need to play that, and we're going to end up checking range and then playing the strategy on the left there. So in these very unfavorable worlds, when we check range, we're supposed to face B33 all the time, and the reason for this is that villain's range is actually still quite merged. Although villain has some nutted combos like Jack 10, 9s, 8s and 7s, and 6-5 suited, they're also going to have some fairly mediocre hands like pocket 6s or 10-9. So villain's range is not super polarized. We probably have a more polarized range because we have sets, we have straights, we have overpairs, whereas villain just has more mediocre hands like pocket pairs like 5s in their range. Villain should bet small, not needing to rush pot growth, not really being that much more polarized than us if at all, and should bet often. We should check raise or check fold, but do a bit of check calling as well in this case. The reason we can check call in this situation, but weren't doing so on the more dry and innocuous low board, is that this is a board that neutralizes nut advantage much more. We don't have as polarized a range as we had on 4-4 deuce, but we still have a polar enough range to play a lot of check raising. Clark's theorem also says that out of position, the most polar range, should mainly respond with fold or a large investment, but this is less true here, as I say. Be careful, again I'll stress this, I'll reiterate, we're not going into our shell, we're not checking here with jacks just so we can meekly check call and then check fold to turn, unless we're against an absolute net that never bluffs. We're not going to do that, we're just going to start with a check because our range wants to do that and we don't have the urgency that forces us to bet. This is a really important point, try and remember that your main aim for checking is not fear, it's actually just playing in harmony with how your range wants to approach the spot. Let's think in SPR. This is a really important point. When you give a solver a bunch of inputs and tell it to run its magic algorithm that gives you the result that you see in the pretty hand grid with all the colors, what you're actually seeing is the result of SPR, input ranges, and bet sizing options. Nothing else. These are the only ingredients of the cake that the solver bakes. The solver doesn't care how many absolute big blinds are in the pot. It doesn't care how many you bought in for at the start of the game, what your bankroll is, or what kind of dinner you could buy with the pot if you were to win it. The solver only cares about SPR, that's stack to pot ratio. Thinking in terms of stacks is completely irrelevant. Your brain will do this because humans are trackers. We keep track of our resources because this is a completely necessary condition for our survival. If we didn't know how many resources we had, how much money we had, how much food we had in the house, it'd be very difficult to survive optimally. So we're wired to think in this way. But this is a psychological trap that originates from the fear of ruin, having nothing, and ultimately dying. When we're playing poker, hopefully it's not life and death, it's not some back room with pistols in the Wild West in 1972. Rather, we're playing online with a lightning speed internet connection and we've got plenty of buy-ins in our bankroll. If we're approaching poker professionally, and imagine that many of you are at least approaching it seriously or semi-professionally if you're working through this course, you're going to not actually need to worry about how many stacks you win or lose in one session, although it will feel like you do. When you switch away from fears of being stacked, losing 100 big blinds or losing X money, and actually detach that from success or failure, you're free to play in a much more logical way and a way that's much more akin to GTO. What is the strategic difference between these two 100 zoom situations, for example? In situation A, you're dealt jacks in the small blind. Stack is $48 because the button limps and that's how much money they have. They limp the top 40% of hands. They're a player that has a HUD like 40-0, maybe 25-0, but it's a bit wider from the button. So when button limps, you decide to raise. You make a 2-bet to $5, not a 3-bet because there's been no preflop raise yet. You use a 16% range, which is typical of what you might 3-bet against a similar opening range width. Button decides to call with a condensed range. They would have 4-bet their best stuff and folded their worst stuff. All is normal. On the flop, the pot is $11, the effective stack is $43, and the SPR is therefore 3.9. This is just stack divided by pot. Flop comes 9-8-7, a horrible board for small blinds range, but a good one for jacks. Understanding that this flop is awful, the small blind checks, and the button decides to make a small bet. The button picks the right sizing here. Stacks are short, there's no need to rush pot growth. The SPR is not that big, even though it's only a single raise pot. Small blind raises 3x, a normal sizing at this SPR. Button jams, something they're allowed to do a lot given that small blind is raising quite a lot of merged hands, and small blind decides to call. All the money goes in. How are you feeling as small blind? Most people would feel pretty good in this situation, or at least okay. Situation 2, you have jacks in the small blind, but the stack is now 100 bigs, and button raises 2.5x, again with the top 40% of hands. We go for a 3-bet to 11 with again 16% range, and button again calls a standard condensed range. This time the pot is $23, the effective stack is 89, but the SPR is identical to what it is on the left hand side. The solver, running its algorithm and truth seeking this spot, will absolutely play in exactly the same way as the small blind player here and as the button. There is no difference whatsoever to the solver in this spot. Of course in practice you can make inferences like villain is a weaker player on the left hand side and is therefore getting it in too light or something of that nature, and you might be right, but that doesn't really change the theoretical outlook. How do you feel when you felt jacks in a 3-bet pot for 100 bigs? You feel worse because you're risking more big blinds while the solver doesn't see the difference. If you keep the inputs and the SPR, the starting ranges, and its bet sizing options consistent across both of these game trees, the solver cannot tell the difference. You need to work on your understanding of SPR being what matters, because at low SPRs, and we'll see this a lot in grade 3, we want to do a lot of chaotic reinvesting. We want to jam flops with merged hands. We want to check raise the turn, even though we know we'll lose a lot with a semi-value betting hand, and we need to be okay with it. What we should try to understand at low SPR is that you're not risking much in relation to the pot you're trying to win. Your risk is only important in poker compared to your reward unless you're playing under-rolled or in a game you shouldn't be in, or unless you have mental game leaks that need sorting. We all start with this risk aversion when we're deeper stacked, and we're all much more okay with case B than case A, but that's usually a delusion. Exploitative considerations like opponent type aside, we need to work on seeing these spots as the same thing. Time for another fallacy. You know I like to throw these at you guys every few slides. This fellow here says the following. He says, so we're betting small here because we're betting often. You hear this a lot, but the problem is that you can't just choose both of these things at the same time without thinking about their separate variables. How big you bet is a function of relative polarization, aka nut advantage, and how often you bet is of course down to the equity of your range against that of your opponent. The problem here is that we're using an input to determine an input. It doesn't make sense. While a small bet will often be accompanied by frequent betting, this is mistaking correlation for cause. For example, betting small and betting often are both outputs in the same way that the sound of water boiling and the bubbles appearing are both outputs. Imagine saying that the sound of the water boiling caused the bubbles in the pan to appear. This would be very weird because you're citing something that occurs simultaneously to something else as its origin. This is impossible. One output cannot cause another output which occurs at the same time as it does. High temperature is one input, and that causes the sound of the water boiling and also the visual effect of the bubbles forming. The high temperature is the common input to both of these outputs. The problem in poker is that the frequency that you bet at and the sizing you choose don't have the same input, so they can't just be decided at the same time like this. Favorability of the world you're in and mainly range equity against that of your opponent's range is what's going to determine bet frequency, and Clark's theorem, aka polarization advantage / nut advantage, will determine sizing. Betting small regularly coincides with betting frequently because it's very common that we have a range advantage without a nut advantage. The reason for this is that the very cards that tend to bolster our range advantage also tend to remove our nut advantage. For example, a king high flop is going to make our range advantage bigger, but it's going to polarize our opponent's range. Sometimes you can do the unthinkable. If you study GTO, you'll know that there are big range bet strategies, and this is one of them. EV is so high here that we want to increase the pot very frequently. Every hand in our range does better by betting than by checking for the most part, because villain's investment level is not going to be high if we check, yet their fold frequency will be through the roof if we bet. Favorability therefore says bet all of your range, and Clark's theorem says bet big. You've got a way more polarized range than that capped range of your opponent over there on the button. This is what it looks like. It's shocking. You wouldn't even think it was possible, but it is. No, you don't have to polarize just because you're betting big, and no, the sound of water boiling does not cause the bubbles. Both things happen at the same time, just in the same way as sizing and frequency are separate outputs of these two inputs. Small blind bets big with range. In this situation, we see a 98.31% bet frequency. I think you guys know that I would simplify this to always betting, and we wouldn't see any EV loss here. As we can see, both inputs may point in aggressive or passive directions. The following four strategies are all potentialities in no limit hold'em, on the flop, small blind versus button, 3-bet pot. You can have a merged bet that's small. In other words, you're betting very often but for a small sizing. You want to do this in situations like ace-ace-10 where you have a massive range advantage but villain has been very polarized by this flop coming down. If villain doesn't have an ace-ace-10 or pocket tens, they're going to have a really lousy hand for the most part, but when they have those hands, they're going to have a monster. Villain's range en masse indifferent, you don't have to use a big sizing. So we go small, but we go merged because we're really happy with life. We can also bet range really big on a board like 10-4 deuce. This is just a cousin of jack deuce deuce, a slightly less favorable one, but definitely a board that's of similar nature. And we want to use a merged big bet like the one we see on screen here for that board too. A polarized small bet would happen on a texture like ace-6-3 monotone. In these situations, we don't want to bet large because of the polarization of our opponent's range. Hands like sixes are very strong, anything with a diamond is pretty good, and anything that's unpaired without a diamond or pocket pair without diamond is pretty trashy. For this reason, if we go too big, we'll be overspending in order to render the bulk of villain's range indifferent. In other words, if you can make villain's range 0 EV for the most part with a smaller bet, why would you want to donate extra to pocket sixes or a flush? On this board, we have a massive nut advantage, but the range equities are roughly equal, so we opt for a polarized big bet strategy, making sure protect our checking range and go for loads of check raises. For this week's homework, I'd like you to look at your own hands. We've discussed plenty of these examples, so I don't think you need any more classroom spots from me, so why not go into your database and try to pick out a hand where you've played small blind against button as small blind in a 3-bet pot. When you find the hand, have a look at the flop frequency and sizing recommended. You do this 3 times would be good, but at least do it once. Secondly, look at where your hand falls into the strategy that you are going to build. So basically, picking the sizing that your range will use, picking the rough bet frequency globally, and then seeing where your hand fits into it. It's very important that you do things in this order because you're training yourself to think strategically and then think pragmatically. You don't want to be going straight to your hand, but you don't want to be ignoring what your cards are either. If you're range betting, you can maybe ignore your hand, but that's a separate point. Finally, I want you to look in part C about how your understanding of this spot has changed in the last 2 weeks. What did you think 2 weeks ago? How were you playing these situations? And how are you playing them now? Sometimes it can be really useful to be very explicit and black and white about how your game is evolving. If you want to keep the positive changes you're making in your game, it's a good idea to revise exactly the form those changes are taking. Hope you've enjoyed Lecture 9, and I'll see you back here for Lecture 10 when we're going to talk about raising. This has been Pete Clark with the Carrot Poker School. Good luck at the tables, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now.